Yeah, looks like we're live. Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. I'm really happy today. I have with me Hassan Ridwan. Hi, Hassan. How are you?
Hello. I'm good. I'm fine, thanks.
So before we get into the discussion, I actually wanted to share why I decided to call Hassan Ridwan on the podcast. So actually, you guys have seen me talk to a lot of ex-Muslims in the past. We've had Haris Sultan, we had Marwa, we had Walid Wen, we had Armin Nawabi. But if there was a godfather in the true sense of the ex-Muslim movement, it is actually Hassan Ridwan. And I know a lot of people, especially my viewers, you guys, from India, and basically most of my viewers are from India, and you guys may not know a lot about Hassan. So I'm really excited about this, because if somebody should be given the real credit for starting this movement, it's actually Hassan Ridwan. So Hassan, thanks a lot for doing this. And let's start with this, Hassan. I actually wanted you to tell everyone a little bit about yourself, about your journey, because obviously a major portion of your life you were a practicing, I don't know if I would call the word a devout Muslim, but at least a practicing Muslim, or someone who identified with the Muslim community. So why don't we start with your journey first, and then let's get into some intricate details about some concepts you talk about. So go for it, Hassan.
Okay. No, I was definitely a devout Muslim. I would describe myself as a devout Muslim. I mean, a lot of people seem to associate devout Muslim with being an extremist, but that's not the case. You can be very devout, very religious, but not an extremist. I would just say I was an ordinary Muslim, but I was very believing. I was very devout. I prayed all my prayers. I was, I did all the sunnahs and the nawafil and everything. And my whole community, my whole life was centered around Islam, and my family, my children, even my work. I was a school teacher at an Islamic school for 15 years. And really up until the age of 48, I would say, so nearly half a century, I was a practicing and a very devout Muslim. I was never into politicized Islam, political groups. So I always viewed the Salafis and Hezb Tahrir and all these kind of political movements with a bit of skepticism. But I was certainly very, very devout. And, for nearly 50 years, I fasted. Ramadan is starting tonight. I always get a strange feeling, mixed emotions when Ramadan starts, because it has some nice memories, but it has some not so nice feelings inside me as well. So it's kind of mixed. But I think, it's strange. It's unusual for someone in the later stage. A lot of people who leave Islam are usually younger. I don't know many people who leave at the age of around 50. And so it was unusual. It was very difficult and quite traumatic, to be honest with you. I started having doubts. And at first I tried to go on the Reform Islam movement. And we'll talk about that later. I still have some sympathy and empathy with those who wish to reform Islam. But eventually it just felt disingenuous and dishonest. And I just, at the end of the day, I had to admit that I just didn't believe that the Quran was the word of God. I didn't believe that, these things that were being said were good and moral. There were some good things, but there were some things which, I totally rejected. And then I, went through a period, actually, when I lost my faith, I went through a period of depression, because, when you lose that faith, you sort of lose that. What's right and wrong? What's the moral standard? What's the meaning of life? And I think I went through a kind of a nihilistic phase where nothing means anything. It was quite a difficult period for me, and it's taken a long time. But I'm finally in a very good place now, where I'm kind of like, at peace with the universe, if you like. I'm at peace with the fact that I don't know. It's I think Voltaire said that doubt is an uncomfortable position, but certainty is a ridiculous one. And for sure, I can agree with that. That to be certain about metaphysical issues is just ridiculous. But doubt is an uncomfortable position. We don't like to admit our ignorance. We want to say that we know, the answers. But when you actually come to terms with the fact that we don't know, it's actually quite, you feel a real sense of inner peace, that I never felt when I was a Muslim, to be honest with you. I can look people in the face and just say, I don't know. These big questions, I really don't know. And really nobody knows. It's as simple as that. It was hard leaving the community because, I mean, I'm still part of the Muslim community. And of course, religion, a lot of the attraction of religion is that it gives you that community, that sense of belonging, that sense of identity. And that is a very, very difficult thing to go through. And all ex-Muslims will tell you that that's something that they, struggle with. But now I'm in a good place, and now my daughter's come out, and my son-in-law's come out. And actually, when I first came out back in 2006, 2007, it was completely different. There were no ex-Muslims, and I thought I was the only one. But now in 2019, things have changed radically, absolutely unbelievable. I couldn't have imagined how things have changed, and it seems to be just exponentially sort of increasing.
Yeah, I always wanted to understand this, and I asked this from everyone who's kind of lost their faith. Doesn't matter which faith it is. So once so two books always interested me, because one was Shadi Hamid's Islamic Exceptionalism, and the other one was Majid Nawaz and Sam Harris, based their conversation. I keep forgetting the name of the book. In that, both of them use this word gradualism. Basically, the concept is that on one side, there is the Islamist who's trying to make the Islamic society, whether it's Egypt or Turkey, more and more Islamic gradually. And Majid Nawaz talks about the reformist, where they're trying to make Islamic societies more and more secular gradually. Now, what I wanted to ask you about it is, so what was it that made you lose your faith? Like, was it an instant process, or was it like a gradual build-up where, you go on asking questions and this doesn't make sense, this doesn't make sense? Because you are someone who's actually well-versed with Islam. You're not a cafeteria Muslim, right? You don't pick and choose. You are a well-versed someone who could actually be a scholarly practitioner of Islam. So what was it that made you leave Islam? Because your journey could not be of the person, who just says, I don't buy it anymore. I don't like religion. Maybe I like alcohol too much, or maybe I like partying too much. There are real people who do that. I mean, these are, cafeteria followers, your regular followers of religion who just dump it for the weirdest reasons. But what was it that made you leave? Because you were quite well versed with Islam.
It was definitely a gradual thing. I mean, it didn't happen all of a sudden. It happened over a long period of time. And I mean, even back in the day when I would say I was at the height of my, fervor, Islamic fervor, and very religious, and I think it's true for all Muslims as well, there are issues which trouble you, which you can't quite answer. And I always used to put them in a box labeled, God will explain that later. But you are willing to give these things a free pass because you've got a faith in the overall story, and you're feeling comfortable within that story. You're feeling emotionally comfortable. You're feeling, you've got your family, you've got your livelihood, and so on. And so you're willing to kind of like turn a blind eye to some of these questions and not look at it too critically. And I mean, when we read the Quran as a Muslim, we don't read it with a critical eye. We read it with the eye of devotion. It's a devotional act. It's prayer. You get ajr, you get reward for actually reading it. And so it's not read, critically, looking for. It's read with faith, not with doubt. And so, I mean, there were lots of things which did trouble me. Things like the verse about hitting a wife. The verse is about hell. And I constantly battled with this idea of hell, and I kept thinking, well, look, it's metaphorical. It's not meant to be taken seriously, and really, it's about human beings are going to face the consequences of how they've hurt people, and they're going to feel that pain. And this sort of imagery of the fire burning your skin is a metaphor for the pain we're going to feel for hurting others, and so on. I kind of like, and I didn't really examine it too critically, but I gave it a bit of a free pass, as I say. And I always put it in the box, God will explain later. God is loving. I believe in this loving, merciful God He is Rahman Rahim. He is Arham Ar-Rahimin. Rahmatuhu wasi'at kulli shay. His mercy envelops everything. And so I held on to that. And my father always used to say God is the most merciful. That's the way I was brought up. You know, my father always emphasized the mercy of God and Allah Kareem, that God is, you know, forgiving and kind and gentle. And so whatever doubts came, I would always put them to the side. And I think majority of Muslims do that. Majority of Muslims do that. They will defend Islam and they will defend things, but they will have issues which they can't fully comprehend, and they say, well, Allahu Alam, God knows best. And I think that most Muslims will stay within their religion on that basis. And it takes a slap in the face. I always say it takes a slap in the face, something to kind of wind you, knock you, and look at Islam from a different perspective. And I had a few things, and there were a few things in my personal life and things that were going on in the outside life. Obviously, in the outside life, there were things like 9/11. There were, you know, issues with political Islam going on around me. There were issues with certain Muslims that I knew in the community. Islamia school was generally, majority of the teachers were wonderful, but there were some individuals there in the community who made me sort of question some of the issues. And there were things going on in my personal life as well. The illness of my son, my divorce, and certain things. And when you get pushed out of that comfort zone, you start to take stock. I mean, I think a lot of people, you know, since I've kind of sort of said my story, a lot of Muslims come up to me, oh, you left Islam because of certain issues that happened to you in your life. Well, the thing is that everyone reacts to issues that happen to them in their life. Everyone does. There'd be something wrong with you if you don't take stock of your life when things happen to you in your life. Because that's what life is. It's a journey of learning and experiencing and reassessing and reevaluating. But actually, those weren't the things that made me leave Islam. Those were the things that drove me to kind of reevaluate Islam and look again at Islam. And that was when I started to read the Quran with a much more critical eye rather than a devotional eye. And I started to, I was discussing a lot with a lot of people who were arguing against Islam. And I said, look, I'm going to be perfectly honest. I'm going to be absolutely, you know, because I've got nothing to hide. Islam is true. But the more I kind of discussed, the more I felt uncomfortable with the answers that I was given, that I was actually giving. And I went to talk to my sheikh at Islamia school, a wonderful guy, Sheikh Ahmed Babakar, I still love him very much, a lovely Sufi guy. And I have great admiration for him. And I had long discussions with him. And he came with lots of good answers, which would have satisfied most people. But they didn't satisfy me at that point in my journey. I was no longer, you know, able to swallow that. And so the more and more I kind of looked at it, then I started to move. But I said, look, we need to reform Islam. We need to, you know, we need to reinterpret Islam. We need to do this. We need to do that. And as I say, eventually it just felt disingenuous. It felt dishonest. And I think there were several points when I actually kind of, it sort of clicked. And I thought, for example, the Quran, you know, is supposed to be the literal word of God. Now, would God say, you know, leave this sort of a verse saying that you're allowed to hit your wife? Is that a way to solve marital problems? And it doesn't matter how you spin that. It doesn't matter how you spin that verse. That's one of the verses that's very difficult to spin, because a lot of problematic verses in the Quran, you can find some apologetics for. But that one's you can't find any apologetics for it. And you've got to say, well, you know, God must have allowed that a man can hit his wife, and that's a reasonable way to solve a marriage problem. And I started to think to myself, well, I think I remember actually thinking at one point, I can't believe that God would say this. I can't believe that this is the word of God. I just simply can't. I tried. I really tried. But I had to admit, I'm sorry, I just can't believe that's God's word.
Don't they say they eventually come down with the logic, right? And that this is, I think, Surah Nisa, right? This verse.
Yes.
That,
yes.
Right? Yeah. Don't they come up with the logic? Oh, it's just a toothbrush. Or
Yes. But that is ridiculous. I find that such a ridiculous thing because it's clearly a desperate attempt to try and soften it. But if you imagine the scenario, it's got 3 steps, which is al-wa'z, which means you have to talk to them, and then there's a wahjuruhum fil madaji, which means separate from them in bed. So in other words, you talk to them, you try to discuss, you get family in, you get counseling. That doesn't work. So you have a trial separation. Okay, so you have a trial separation. Those 2 seem quite reasonable. Those 2 didn't work. So the 3rd step is you say, okay, listen, darling, just stand still for a second. I'm going to get my toothstick and I'm going to tap you on the shoulder, not on the face, because we don't want anything on the face, just on the shoulder. There we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And she's going to say, Habibi, when you talked to me, it didn't make sense. When we separated, it didn't make sense. But now that you've tapped me on my shoulder, it all makes sense. It's like a Monty Python sketch. It's ridiculous. And to say that this is the wise word of a divine being who created this universe is utterly absurd.
Yeah, it's actually everybody, that I've met, a lot of ex-Muslims are like, this one verse, the wife-beating verse, that really gets to us. There are 2 aspects, actually. One, I've discussed this with a lot of Christian atheists and Muslim atheists. They have this in common. One is the depiction of hell. That gets to them. That one really gets to them. They're like, what the hell, man? What kind of a religion is this? You scare the shit out of a child when the child is being raised. It's like, hell is the terrible place. And that gets to them. And with Muslims, I've noticed this particular one, the wife-beating one. Okay, now let's get into the concept of what you have called the agnostic Muslim. Now, I want you to, I know you don't use this term anymore personally too, but I still want you to explain what you really meant when you used the word agnostic Muslim, and why then have you stopped using the term yourself now? So go for it.
Okay. Well, let me just begin, because I get a lot of grief about this. A lot of people keep saying, why do you call yourself an agnostic Muslim? Okay, I've dropped that label. I don't use that label anymore. However, I did use that label for a while, and I did it for a few reasons. One of the reasons actually was a very utilitarian reason, pragmatic reason, which was basically I wanted to soften the blow for some members of my family. I wanted to pacify them. I wanted to make them feel that I hadn't kind of left the fold. So that was a kind of like a pragmatic reason. The other reason was that I genuinely thought that Islam could be reformed. And my idea of an agnostic Muslim was that basically we need to look at the Quran as a human fallible text and not as the divine, literal, infallible word of God. Now, to be fair, there are some Islamic scholars who are beginning to take that position. To call it a minority position actually doesn't go far enough. It's a position which is rejected by the vast majority of Muslims, and I came across so much resistance to it when I tried to advocate for this position. But to be fair, there are a few. For example, Abdul Karim Soroush, the Iranian scholar. There's Ahmed al-Qabbanji, the Iraqi scholar, and there's Saeed Nasheed, the Moroccan scholar. All argue that the Quran can be seen as the words of Muhammad, basically, and so the idea is that Muhammad was inspired with ideas and concepts, but not with literal, actual words. And so he then articulated these ideas and concepts according to his mentality, according to the Judeo-Christian environment he lived in, according to the 7th century, and according to Arab customs and so on. And so what we actually have are Muhammad's words, which are fallible and very context bound. And I used to argue, I used to say, okay, well, we can still, draw inspiration from this, but we do not have to take it literally. We do not have to take everything word for word. We can reject parts. We can simply say that part, for example, about hitting the wife is wrong, and we don't, we can just ignore that now. There are parts in the Quran which are still valid and useful, but there are parts which are completely out of date, and we can ignore and we can dismiss without any sort of a compunction. And that was my idea about the agnostic Muslim. And I mean basically I used to say reason over revelation, and that okay, fine, God has given us revelations in various ways to various people, but the most important thing he has given us is our reason, is our mind, and that should be number one over any kind of ancient text. And so we should use our own fitra, which in Islam is the inner conscience, if you like, our inborn innate nature, moral compass, if you like, and we should use that as our guide and our reason. So our fitra and our reason as our guide to deciding what we need to use. So basically that was it. Yeah.
So that sounds a lot like the Methuselah concept of the akl and nakl, right? So the Methuselah, they would talk about this, right? We need to reinterpret the Quran, or we need to reinterpret Islam using our akl. So if we use rationality while interpreting religion, we can do all sorts of mental gymnastics, and we can reject X, or we can reinterpret Y, and go ahead with your life. Now, the way you have explained it, that actually sounds quite nice. Why the hell would you reject that?
Well, the reason why I came to reject it was not because I don't think it's a good idea, and I still think that Islam can be reformed that way. I still think that there are, if Muslims genuinely sort of feel sincerely attached to that idea, that they can reform Islam, and Islam can be reformed. I'm not one of those people who says Islam can't be reformed. Of course it can be reformed. Of course, all religions evolve. Every single religion evolved. Islam has evolved. Every religion has. But the reason why I personally couldn't do that was because it just felt disingenuous. At the end of the day, I mean, I was at the point where you're basically saying, okay, you're sort of holding on to this book, but you're saying, I'm going to use my fitra, my inner conscience, my moral compass, and my reason to apply things. Well, you can do that without the book. You don't need the book. And you can pray in your own way. Basically, that it just seemed that I'm dragging this millstone with me for no reason. Why not just let go of the millstone?
Yeah, but then, okay, now I'm going to try to play the devil's advocate here. So let's say you get rid of it. Now, here's how I look at it. And I have always, this has been my standard question to every atheist or ex-Muslim that has come on my podcast. So I always tell them, let us look at religions as mnemoplexes, right? A set of ideas, ancient ideas that have been used over a period of time in post-agricultural societies, because I think religion was the only way we could have, managed to gather a large burgeoning population of humans at that point of time. I think religion was a natural evolutionary outcome of a specific need of human beings at that point of time. Now, obviously, we can say it's a useless product right now, but it's still the strongest game in town when it comes to, ideas around which large number of people's bandy around. Now, when we get rid of the baggage, as I'm using the word you said, I don't need the book or the baggage of that book. I can be a nice person without it. Absolutely. And I'm on the same boat. But the point is, it's not merely the book. There are a lot of other peripheral things that come around, along with religion, which is a sense of community, a sense of camaraderie, the emotional support, the societal support. Now, obviously, you live in a country, you live in a Western country, but I come from India. Now, in India, it's not like the banking system is that robust that everybody and anybody can get a loan from a bank so easily. So most of your financial support is actually community driven, and most of that community is tied to religion. if religion did not exist, we would actually have a kind of a crisis here. Because if I can tell you communities, I'm sure you must have heard of the Patel community in England too. The Patels are quite famous in America. They own most of the motels, by the way. So most of the financial support in the Patel community is not through banks. It's actually within the community. So one guy becomes rich, then he'll call two people from the village to the urban center, and they'll be like, okay, here's some money. You guys also set up the business. You just go somewhere else. And they just capture the whole market. Now, religion has kind of become that community, binder of that sort. So when we leave that and we say, okay, I don't really need this to be a moral person anymore. I get your point. But don't you think there is a huge void that we create in our own lives? What do you think about that?
No, I actually totally agree with you. Community is an extremely important aspect of religion, and it's maybe its strongest aspect, actually. But this was one of the reasons why I became disenchanted with my attempts to, because it was rejected by the community. It was rejected by those around me. It was rejected by those I talked to. And I think that the thing is that once you undermine the principles of a community to such an extent, the community itself will just reject it and will reject you. Now, it maybe sometime in the future things move on so much that the community will accept that, but at the present it doesn't. And I'm just a single individual who really, I thought I should be brave. I should be just not thinking of myself, but thinking of the future, and just trying to be courageous and trying to keep pushing this for the sake of the good of the community. But at the end of the day, I became tired and weary of it, and it just seemed like I was, as I say, dragging this millstone when I could just let go of it. And maybe others will come with more energy and who are younger than me to do that. But I just feel I didn't have the belief in it. I didn't have the you've got to believe it, really. You've got to believe it, because you can only fight for something unless you've really got belief in it. You can't do it if you're kind of doing it as a utilitarian sort of pragmatic kind of attitude. You've got to have some belief in it, and I just didn't have that belief.
So do you think this problem of abandonment, and it's either this or that, happens to happen more right now within the Islamic milieu, in, let's say, in comparison to Christians? Like, I'll give you an example. The other day I was listening to Bill Burr on Joe Rogan's podcast, and Bill Burr is an atheist, and they were just having this discussion, him and Joe Rogan, and Bill Burr was like, I'm 50 years old now, I'm starting to go to the church. So Joe kind of got a shock, and Joe Rogan tells him, like, what are you believing in that shit again? He's like, nah, I just like the community, I just go there. So, and it was very natural. Not that the church had a problem with it or not. And I see in America, you have these, Democrat supporting churches too, progressive churches. They call them progressive churches, where they have a very different attitude towards a lot of, obviously the conservatives don't agree with that, but you still have that kind of a community support over there. Do you think, let's say 20, 30 years down the line, when more and more ex-Muslims come out, more and more people come out openly that I have a problem with this, I have a problem with that in Islam, you'll have more atheists, and it will be very open and normal. Do you think the mosques, I'm not talking about the extremist mosque where there is a sermon that, we should kill the kuffar, but obviously not all mosques give that sermon. It's just impossible that every single mosque has the same sermon. They might say the same verse, but their interpretation of that verse might be different from the other mosque, right? So do you think 20, 30 years down the line, you could actually have that kind of a scenario where maybe ex-Muslims who are today 25, 26 years old, and they are 50 then by the time, they might start going to the mosque, and the mosque will be just like that progressive church? Do you see any progressive mosques coming up in the future?
I do, and I think that it will happen. At the moment, there's hardly any. I used to attend something called the Inclusive Mosque, which I think there is really only one in the whole of Great Britain, and it's a mosque where lesbians, gays, women give the khutbah. they invite everybody, doesn't matter what religion, whether you're Hindu, atheist, Jew, ex-Muslim. I used to go there, and I still feel that kind of. I mean, sometimes I like to go into an empty mosque and just sit there. I like to sit in an empty church, a beautiful cathedral. I prefer it when it's empty, to be honest with you. I did try to find a space for me as somebody who doesn't believe in any religion, as agnostic, within some sort of spiritual community. And I really did try. I tried within the Muslim community. The inclusive mosque was pretty good, but I still didn't feel, because a lot of the things that were being said I found were disingenuous. There were all these kind of apologetics, which I really dislike. And although I empathize with those who are reinterpreting the text, me personally, I know Arabic. I know that it doesn't mean what they're saying it means. I know it doesn't mean that. And so sitting there in the mosque, all kind of, pious and everything, listening to these words, I can't feel that connection. I can't feel that connection. I've been to a Unitarian church. I've been to a Quaker meeting. I've been to all sorts of things. And all of them, I didn't feel that sense of community. So, yes, you're right. We do need that community. And it is important to us. But at the moment, it's not there. And especially Islam hasn't moved to that stage yet. Maybe it will in the future, but certainly not yet. We're a long, long, long way away from it. And as I say, when you undermine the sort of traditional principles to such an extent, you're distancing yourself from that community. And unless that community is willing to change and move on, then you're just an outsider still.
Fair enough. All right. So this is what, why I find this fascinating is I think somewhere down the line, it has also got to do with the base structure or the core structure of Islam. Now, I'll tell you, my experience has been totally different. Born and raised in India. Yeah, I lived in the West for a while, but came back to India then. Now, I have been what I call myself. I don't like to use the word atheist because, in Hinduism, it makes no sense. So, but I'm a skeptic. I deny all supernatural claims of Hinduism, all of them, A to Z, whether it's any Indian religion, I just deny their supernatural claims. But I have never faced hostility. I go to temples even now. There's a temple inside my own house. My mom and dad, I live with my parents, like all Indian kids do. We live with our parents. And, every year we have the celebrations at home. We do the Diwali puja, we do the Navratri puja, and I attend it with my parents. I even bow down to the idol. I don't see anything divine in it. And I would be a liar if I said I don't feel a sense of community with the larger Hindu society in spite of denying every single claim that they have. But there's a key difference here. When I go to a temple during Navratri, or, I go to any place in India, I don't see any kind of a proselytization happening with me. I don't see any kind of forcibly. And they'll be like, oh, there's an atheist in the room. We know he denies that, but we love him. We welcome him. And it's okay. We're not going to change our meaning for him. But this community is for all of us, including atheists. And it's a very separate vibe that I get in the Hindu community, especially in the urban centers. I get it. In rural India, there's still a lot of casteism, etc., etc. And Hinduism actually has a long way to go. But in urban centers, or when you go in the West, you go to a Hindu temple in the West, it's the same vibe you get over there. So do you think somewhere down the line, the way Islam is structured, that it's either this or this, and you have to pick, it's like pick team A or pick team B? Is that the reason somewhere down the line most Muslims at the end of at the end of the day, they get turned off? Do you think that's the reason?
Yes, I do. In Islam, you're always offered that binary choice. You either accept it all or you are out. It's interesting talking about Hinduism. Hinduism is very different from the Abrahamic religions. And it's a shame in a way that humanity evolved in the way that Hinduism was kind of like suffered, if you like, from the hands of Abrahamic religions. Because I think that had Hinduism become the dominant worldwide religion, we would see, for example, in the West, because I think a lot of the problems in India and in many of the third world countries is because they're third world countries. Whereas in the West, where we've had a lot of enlightenment, had it been Hinduism rather than Christianity, we would see some, I think, a religion which we could all, happily feel a sense of community and a sense of that numinous, whatever it is, without having to buy into a lot of dogma. But unfortunately, it's not been the case. And Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, but I mean, those Islam and Christianity especially are the religions that have come to dominate. And unfortunately, they are very much, and especially Islam, are very much either all or nothing. And they have very evangelical, very aggressive type of, throughout their history, lists of doctrines that you must accept. And if you don't accept them, then, there's been inquisitions and there've been mihnas and all sorts of punishments, and they've led to authoritarian clergy and so on. So it's very difficult for that to change. I think that, you see Christianity has changed a lot. And there's no reason why Islam can't as well, because at the end of the day, it's from the same source. It's although I know a lot of Christian fundamentalists like to say, "Oh, Islam is completely different," but it's not. It's actually pretty much the same religion. It's just a little bit further down the evolution. But the biggest hurdle for Islam is the Quran and the way that the Quran is viewed. Although the Bible is also viewed as the Word of God, it's inspired writers. Whereas the Quran is the literal word, verbatim speech of God. And that's a difficult hurdle for a lot of Muslims to overcome. And talking about hell, hell was really my major issue with Islam. And that was really what was the final thing that broke the camel's back, the final straw. Because the Quran describes, and you can't get away from it. There's no apologetics that can get away from this. The Quran describes hell in such graphic, gruesome detail that doesn't exist in the Bible, by the way, and it's so cruel, it's so sadistic, and at the same time you've got this God who's supposed to be merciful, and you've got this eternal torture. It simply doesn't make sense, and there's this inculcates, I can't remember who said it, but the one who believes in a cruel God becomes a cruel person. If you believe in that cruelty, if you're justifying that cruelty, it's going to grate against your soul. It's going to grate against your person, and no matter how you try to soften it and apologize for it, it leaves a rather cruel tinge to somebody's ideologies and beliefs.
Yeah, I completely relate to what you're saying, and like I said before, this has been the common trend when I have spoken to people who come from Islamic backgrounds or Muslim backgrounds or even Christian backgrounds for that matter. Now I wanted to talk to you about reform, about Islamic reform, and there seems to be various versions of what Islamic reform means. Now let me state what I mean when I say Islamic reform. It is out and out mental gymnastics. Any kind of reform with religion, does not matter which religion it is all mental gymnastics if you're reinterpreting the verse. It's mental gymnastics. With Hinduism, luckily, the Hindus came up with a good concept where, when it comes to the Smriti verses, which are the rule books, how to live your life according to, they actually said you can reject it. The damn book said you can reject it if you want to. Not the Vedas. Vedas can't be rejected. They are the eternal word. But the Smritis could be, and most of the rules governing your life all come from the Smritis. So you can reject all the Smritis basically in Hinduism. But with all the three Abrahamic religions, they have this problem, the God's word problem, if you were to say that. Now, how do you reject God's word? So you have to reinterpret God's word. But now I sometimes feel people are unfair to Muslims, and I'll tell you why. Judaism, the Old Testament, if we look at the amount of violent verses in the Old Testament, there are far more violent verses in the Old Testament than you would even find in the Quran. I mean, I have read them both in detail, and I was actually counting the number of verses, and I have completely forgotten how many times God wanted to kill XYZ in the Old Testament in comparison to the Quran. But yes, God really wanted to kill far more in the Old Testament than in the Quran. In that sense, the Old Testament is far more violent, but you don't associate that with the Jews. You don't associate that with Christianity either. Today, if we go out, it's not like the Old Testament has any verse that has changed, or the New Testament has any verse that has changed. But still, Christianity has been reformed. Judaism has been reformed. But when it comes to Islam, somehow, whether it's the hardliners or whether it's the hardline atheists, both seem to not give this privilege or this option to Islam, that you cannot reform. Don't you think that's a little unfair?
It is unfair. It is unfair. But what I will say is that in the case of Judaism, because Judaism is not an evangelical religion, they are not interested in converting others, and they regard the Torah as speaking to them only. And so it was it's easier for them to contextualize the Old Testament, and they're not out to push this on anybody else. When it comes to Christianity, now they are out to push things on other people. However, and of course they've got a pretty bloody history as well. However, it's been easier for them to disassociate themselves from the Old Testament. By the way, I totally agree. The Old Testament is number one when it comes to violence. But it's easier for them to dissociate because they've got the New Testament, you see, because they say, oh, well, that was the Old Testament. That was for the historical period. And you'll find all Christians will do that. Whatever you want to say about that, it gives them that get out clause. So both Jews and Christians have that little bit of a get out clause, that leeway whereby they can contextualize and ignore some of the more nasty bits. But it's harder for Muslims. It's harder for Muslims because the Quran is one single book that is for all time and all places. It's very hard to contextualize it. Having said that, I agree with you that it's unfair to say that Muslims can't. I believe Muslims can, and they are doing that. They are doing that. I mean, I keep saying this because people talk about Islam as if it's one single monolith. It's not. There are lots of Islams. There are lots of versions of Islam. And even from early times, Islam has lent itself to a wide variety of interpretations and, huge differences. And there are, esoteric versions, there are Sufi versions, there are more literalist versions, there are versions which rely on the imams and the rightly guided, or in the Shia, for example, the very, their imams are their authority, which is one reason why you find a lot of Shia Islam is actually quite liberal in comparison. Some versions are quite liberal in comparison to Sunni Islam. Wahhabism, you've got, which just ignores the scholars and goes straight back to the texts, and any Tom, Dick, or Harry can say what he wants. And you've got modernists, and you've got progressives, and you've got gay Muslims, and you've got all sorts, and you've got Quranists now as well who reject all the hadith. So you've got massive variety and diversity within Islam. So it is changing. But it's for me, it's a struggle I can't be bothered with anymore. I'm not interested I don't care anymore. I've done that. Good luck to them. As I say, I do think Islam will reform in the future after I'm dead and buried, and after I'm gone. In many generations' times, I think it will reform. But as for me personally, I'm not interested anymore. And what interests me more is that there are huge numbers of Muslims who are still suffering the stigma of, not being allowed to choose their own lifestyle, not being allowed to choose their own beliefs, who are suffering in Muslim countries under death threats, under, all sorts of oppression. And in a sense, I feel that I'm in a position where I'm in a relative free country. I can say what I want. So, I've got more of a duty to stand up for these people. and to, you know, say, look, if you want to leave Islam, you can leave Islam. And yeah, and I'm going to criticize those aspects which, you know, I think are really bad. Things like the you know, the concept of hell, which I think is abuse. I think it's child abuse. You're teaching children that somebody's going to have their skin roasted off repeatedly and their brains boiled and their intestines shredded because they don't believe in certain things. And that's abuse to me, and that needs to be spoken out against.
Fair enough. Now, let's talk about the term ex-Muslim. Now, I have never been convinced by this term personally. I just find it very, very weird. And I'll tell you why I find the term very weird. Now, you've rejected Islam. Okay, get over it, right? That's what I say. Get over it. Why would you want to associate yourself with something that you have rejected? That is something I have never been able to get. It's like, you know, I mean, I don't like a movie. Am I X that movie? No, I don't like some food. Am I X that food? I mean, you get over it, right? And you move forward in your life and you become atheist or you become a secular humanist. The problem that I find with the term ex-Muslim is that there is just no positive doctrine. And for someone to get attracted to anything, and that's the larger problem with, I think, the neo-atheistic movement per se too, that, okay, you suck. You go and tell the religion or the religious people, your ideas suck. That's a load of rubbish. I reject them. Now what? So why do you personally call yourself an ex-Muslim, or do you agree with this term ex-Muslim?
I don't like the term ex-Muslim, and I think that most ex-Muslims don't really like the term ex-Muslim. We don't want to be called ex-Muslim. You know, we don't want to be called an ex-alcoholic or whatever. You know, why would we use that term? But it's unavoidable, and I'll tell you the two reasons. I mean, we get lots of people saying to us, "Oh, why do you call us ex-Muslim?" You know, all the time Muslims are saying what you just said. Why don't you just move on with your life? Well, look, there are two things. Number one is what I was just referring to, that we need to speak out against the taboo of leaving Islam, and that people are being abused, they're being subjected to violence, and in some cases they're being killed, they're being executed. And that's something that we're in a position to speak out against, and we've got a duty. I feel a duty to speak out against this and to speak out against those oppressions. And so I use the term ex-Muslim to help break that taboo. It's as simple as that. I don't want to be called ex-Muslim, but it's a useful term to break that taboo. Secondly, leaving Islam is very difficult, and it creates a lot of emotional trauma. It creates a lot of problems in your society, in your life, and it leaves you with a lot of baggage and a lot of issues that you're dealing with, and that you're working through. And it's kind of like a natural thing. It's kind of, when you stopped working through it, well, that's fine, then you'll move on. But as long as you're still working through stuff, then there are still things that are an issue for you that you've got to kind of resolve. Then you can't really avoid being part of that ex-Muslim movement, because it's something you're still dealing with, and because you've lost a community, you need another support community as well. And so ex-Muslims, come together to help and support each other, because again, we know the various stages that we go through, and we know the difficulties that we go through. And so for those two reasons, one, as I say, to actually speak out against those inequalities and abuses, and secondly, to, because we're going through dealing with the baggage that Islam has left us. If those things didn't exist, the word ex-Muslim wouldn't exist.
Fair enough. Now, I think I can't let you go without having a discussion on, I think, which is a very serious problem. Now, there is criticism of Islam, and then there is genuine bigotry towards Muslims. Every time we criticize a set of ideas, there will be a certain section of society that will take that criticism, even use that criticism, extrapolate from that criticism, and actually generalize and hate the whole set of people by itself? This has been a dilemma that I personally face. I mean, I have Muslims in my own family. My cousins are married to Muslims. They are not religious Muslims, nor are they atheistic Muslims. They're just cafeteria Muslims. That's what I like to call them. They pick and choose Islam, whatever.
Which is most Muslims are like that, actually.
Now, when I criticize Islam, I criticize the idea. I don't criticize the people. You do that. You know, all ex-Muslims do that. But in spite of that, there is going to be genuine bigotry towards Muslims. So what do you think is the most sound way of dealing with bigotry towards Muslims? What do you think is the solution to that?
Okay, I've got to quickly put my plug in, otherwise the battery is going to run out.
No
Just
problem.
Give me 1 second. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Very unprofessional of me, I know.
Ah, it's okay.
There we go. I just got a message saying battery low.
Oh,
right. Well, as you probably know, I am very, very, aware of the fact that there is an awful lot of bigotry directed towards Muslims. Now, I love Muslims. They're my family. They're my friends. I totally empathize with them. The vast majority of Muslims are good, decent, loving people, just like everybody else. And I don't want the things that I say to be used against them. But the thing is, you've got a choice between saying nothing and, saying what you feel and think is right. Now, if all the good, decent people and decent critics of Islam took the route of saying nothing, then that would allow the bigots and the haters to monopolize the debate and allow them to use it for their own agenda, be it a right-wing anti-immigration or a Christian fundamentalist agenda. So I feel, in a sense, I've got to be participating in that debate, because the more reasonable, empathetic voices there are, the more we bring sanity to the debate. And there are now a lot of really good ex-Muslims who are really making a real effort to show their love and their empathy towards Muslims and to criticize the ideas and not Muslims, and make a point of saying that we're not attacking Muslims. Of course, you've got people like Abdullah Samir, you've got Reason on Faith. I don't know whether you saw his new video. He's just come out, an absolutely stunning video, amazing. It's 2 hours long, but it's really worth watching. He speaks my mind totally. But there's lots of people like that now coming out, and we want to show that we are happy to be part of your families. We are part of your families. We are part of the Muslim community, in a sense. We are still counted in with those ethnic groups and so on. And we are not against you. We are not. We don't support all these right-wing racists and so on. But we have something to say, and we want to put it away in the best way we can. So I mean, I remember there was a while back when I stopped making videos for a while because I was so disgusted by some of the people who were commenting on my videos, and it was all this right-wing, horrible hate, bomb Mecca, and put all Muslims in prison camps and education camps and things. And I felt disgusted. I felt sick. I felt sick to the core, because I in no way want to be associated with these disgusting right-wing people, nor with the Christian fundamentalists, who also seem to have nothing but hate. Some of them. But over the years, gradually, we've built up now more and more ex-Muslims are coming out, who are showing that they are not against Muslims. They don't even hate Islam. I don't hate Islam. I have issues with certain aspects of Islam, and if you look at all my criticisms, I always try to be very careful. I never try to attack individuals. I never make things personal. I don't use ad hominem. I critique ideas, and I think I'm generally quite generous and careful. And if you do that, you can change the conversation and hopefully marginalize the more extreme elements.
Sure. So I just wanted to take a couple of questions, because I like the questions in the live chat. So Beej has asked, you had translated some books of Islam, of Islamic scholars in English. Can you give the name of that book?
I translated a book by an Egyptian scholar. Actually, he's not actually Egyptian. I know where he's from. I know his real identity now, but I'm not going to say it online. He is an Arab scholar. He was very religious, and he wrote his story, and it was called My Ordeal with the Quran. You can look it up. You can just put that into a Google search, and you can find it. It's also available in book form on Amazon. All the proceeds go to Oxfam charity, by the way. You can also find it on a Facebook group called the My Ordeal with the Quran Facebook group. And it's translated from Arabic into English. And he gives his story, his own personal story, and also a critique of the Quran.
All right. So Mubin Ahmed asks you, could you ask Mr. Ridwan about his thoughts on the perennial school of thought in Islam?
I'm not really familiar. What does he mean by that? I'm not really sure.
All right. If Mubin, if you can go on further and explain what do you mean by the perennial school of thought, what you can do is you can tweet at Hassan, and he'll clear that. So, all right. Now, before we wrap things up, one last question for you, Hassan. What do you think is the future for Islam, Islamic reform, and the ex-Muslim movement in general? What is the trend that you see? Are you positive? Are you negative? What do you make of it overall?
I'm very positive. I am very, very positive for both Muslims and for ex-Muslims. I think that what we're seeing in the when we see things that are groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda and all these extremist groups, these groups are desperate. And they are losing the battle. They've lost the intellectual battle. They've lost the argument. Their only argument is blood. And I think, who was it? Shakespeare said, "Blood is no argument." They have lost, and they are like a cornered lion that's wounded and scratching and lashing out. They eventually will disappear. They will fade. They are like a firework display that looks awesome, but it's going to go fizzle out eventually. And I see on the one hand, on the Islamic side, I see more and more progressive minds coming forward. I see more and more reformists, reinterpreting the Quran. I think that's going to take an awful long time, though, because as I said, I think, in my opinion, real reform can only come when one questions the divinity of the actual text. And that's going to take a very long time. But eventually it will happen. I also see another trend happening amongst the Muslim community, which is that it kind of doesn't really matter anymore. It kind of, no one cares anymore. It's almost like, and this will happen in a very popularistic way, that it's even happening now, that a lot of ordinary Muslims will not really bother. They don't really care anymore. They've lost that attachment to some dogma, and they've just got this vague sense of identity, and that will continue. And on the ex-Muslim front, I see more and more people leaving Islam and it becoming normalized. And I think eventually it will become normalized, and you will see a Muslim and an ex-Muslim within the same family eating together happily, no problems, and nobody bothering. And the only thing they're talking about is the football and the Champions League, and whether Spurs are going to win the Champions League, which inshallah they will.
I'm not a football fan. I just watch. So all I can say is, as long as India beats England, everything is all right.
I'm not a cricket fan, but yeah, okay.
So guys, as you've seen, I've tried to cover all the questions possible. If you have any other questions for Hassan, you do this thing. I've left Hassan's Twitter handle in the description of the podcast. Just tweet at him directly. He is more than happy to engage with everyone on Twitter. Also, please go and subscribe to Hassan's channel. Again, I've left the link of his YouTube channel in the description of my podcast. I'd recommend each and every one of you go and subscribe to it. I want to end with these words. Every movement, whether it's a religious movement, whether it's a reformist movement within a religion, or whether it's an ex-Muslim or an atheistic movement, every movement, maybe I'm a little old school in that way, it needs a senior elder. If there ever was a senior elder in the ex-Muslim movement, it is Hassan Ridwan. I have never seen him lose it. He's always been balanced. I actually went through quite a few videos of his. I actually saw him chat with Walid too, and he's always got that poise, and he has that sense of balance. And at least I always like that, and it kind of calms me down, and it gives me a sense of balance. I was like, okay, you know what? If shit hits the roof, I want to be with Hassan Ridwan. That's the kind of feeling I get. So Hassan, really, thanks a lot for coming and having this conversation with me.
Thank you so much for having me, and I've got the utmost respect for you, and I always enjoy listening to you. And you've got to honestly, I think you and me are of one spirit, and I bless you. Namaste.
Thanks a lot, guys. And A Krishna, thanks a lot for the super chat. I know you just joined the podcast. So on that note, guys, until next time, namaste, goodbye, good night, take care. See you next time.